Hello, everyone. It's 6 o'clock. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder and director of the Skyscraper Museum, and we have a great deal of interest tonight in a talk by two architects from SOM on the future and the past of Park Avenue, on two projects that SOM is in the middle of right now, almost finishing, Lever House and the Waldorf Astoria. And in our program tonight, Frank Mahan and Amy Garlock will do a tag team pairing. They've been working together on both of these projects, and they'll present each one as a feature, and then have a discussion if we have time, and answer your questions at the end of the talk tonight. But this is the first lecture in a series that we hope to do over the fall and in the rest of the summer, in conjunction with the exhibition that we have mounted now, which is called Skymarks Landmarks. And I'm sitting in the gallery in front of the case that features Lever House, one of the landmarks, the iconic modern landmarks of really just a handful that are protected by the Landmarks Preservation Commission in New York. And in the case of Lever House, since it became 30 years old in 1982. Frank and Amy and SOM were enthusiastic about, and we were thrilled to have them curate the case, which is right behind me, that presents Lever House, which is, of course, the original design by SOM, Gordon Bunshaft in particular, the design principal, and has been the subject of continuous stewardship by SOM over a couple of modernizations and a recladding in 1999, and now a kind of repositioning of elements, and certainly repair of some of the aging features of the materials of the building. So in this exhibition now at the Skyscraper Museum that you can visit on Wednesday through Saturday, called Skymarks Landmarks, we're looking at the buildings that have been individually designated by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Lever House one, as I said, but our other topic, our co-topic for the evening, the Waldorf Astoria, which is especially featured in the show only in the banner of the landing page for the microsite, the virtual exhibition that you see right here. And the Waldorf Astoria takes front and center in this great evocative kind of film noir black and white photo of the skyline and the sky marks of the city in the 1930s. So what Frank and Amy are going to share with us tonight is the history of these projects, as well as the renaissance of them in an adaptive reuse. So let me introduce our speakers, who will then come on the screen as soon as I finish with that. Frank Mahan is a design principal at SOM, and he leads the adaptive reuse kind of leadership segment or practice within SOM. He has a tremendous amount of experience, not just with the Lever House and the Waldorf, but the Air Force Academy in Colorado, the manufacturer Hanover's building down on right close by here on Lower Broadway, and then just next to it, One Chase Manhattan Plaza. These classic, iconic, modern skyscrapers of SOM's great period of definitive modernism. He will talk to us tonight about these projects and about the idea of adaptive reuse and some of the lessons learned. Working with Frank on both of these projects is Amy Garlock, who is an associate principal at SOM, and where she's been for, I think, 9 years. I neglected to mention that Frank was trained as an architect undergraduate, first in California, but then went to school taking a master's from Princeton in the School of Architecture. And Amy likewise has a BA in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, and then went to Harvard to the GSD for her master's. So Together, they represent the kind of younger generation of SOM and the new areas that SOM is advancing in a practice which sometimes goes back to the stewardship of their original designs and sometimes is focused on completely reinventing a building which is in a completely different language than the aesthetics that SOM has practiced for now more than 70, almost 80 years. So Amy, will you and Frank please come on the screen and I will leave. Thank you, Amy and Frank, and please begin.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. Hello to everyone. Thank you, Carol, for that gracious introduction. And thank you especially for the invitation to deliver this lecture. We're very excited and we'll share our screen and dive right in here. I'm Frank, and Carol said she's sitting in Skyscraper Museum. We're sitting not too far from her at SOM's office, where we're going to share our work on these two projects. So, Carol asked us, to speak about these two projects in particular, the Waldorf Astoria and Lever House. I'm just going to dive right in.
Yep, and I'll join in the second half to talk about Lever House.
So have a look at these two images, both taken shortly after the completion of each of these projects and how different these two buildings look. Believe it or not, these two buildings are not only 3 blocks from one another, they were also built only 2 decades apart from one another. So what a transformative period for this very concentrated area at the center of our city. Of course, these two individual buildings share a common location, Park Avenue, an incredibly important promenade in New York as well as the world, whose real estate was in a sense created out of thin air, if you will. Many of you likely know the story of how the trains entering Grand Central, which you see at the center of this image, were depressed into a sunken trench when they were electrified and then eventually covered over and creating the new real estate for Park Avenue. And this brand new avenue created out of thin air became instantly a kind of civic space for New York, where celebrations were held here, celebrating the victory of World War I, or everyday use, really as a public park for recreation, for strolling down the park of Park Avenue, or today for the lighting of the trees along Park Avenue. I take my daughter Caroline and we watch as the trees are lit up every year at Christmas time, or during open streets in recent years when Park Avenue is cleared of cars and New Yorkers of all stripes from all boroughs come out and enjoy this great civic public space, a great lung for the city. Now, the backdrop, the architectural backdrop for this public space has of course evolved over time from a kind of continuous masonry street wall. You can see it's very, very consistent, and the height is very even here, and that was the case on both sides of the avenue, to the beginnings of the introduction of new kind of architecture, beginning really with Lever House, which at the time, if you look at this photo, must have just looked like a spaceship had landed on Park Avenue amongst all of these other masonry buildings all lined up for 2 miles up and down the avenue. To what we have today, which really is a kind of collection of the greatest hits, the greatest architectural hits over time for the city of New York. So if we look at this map, just in a small section from 49th Street to 54th Street, we have 5 individually designated landmarks, or recognized by the city of New York, and I'm sure more to come. So it's evolved from a kind of consistency to really the kind of greatest hits over time. And 2 of those designated landmarks, Waldorf Astoria on the left and Lever House on the right, engage with that public space that is Park Avenue in a meaningful way. So the Waldorf Astoria invites the people into the building, has very generous public spaces, which we'll talk about, and Lever House invites them onto the site in the form of this open plaza, which Amy will tell us more about in a bit. And so both of these projects, as Park Avenue evolves and becomes this series of all-star players, seek to ensure that future by restoring that past. And so our experience and our thesis is that the restoration of these two projects is really a transformative act, one that builds a bridge to a new future for the buildings themselves and for their participation in the civic ballet that is the architecture along Park Avenue. So how might one go about an architectural project with that lofty idea in mind? Well, we try to balance three competing ideas. One being the original design intent. So what did the architects want to happen? How can we discover that through original source material, which is not always what was built? The second ingredient in this recipe is the existing conditions, often different than the original design intent and also different than what was originally built. We have to discover that through deep research. And then finally, the things that happened at these buildings. So existing buildings, working on one is different than a new building because these buildings accumulate their own history. They accumulate the experiences of the people that were there and use them. And those experiences are in fact just as important in the future of the building as was the architect's original design intent. So these ingredients have to be balanced and mixed together, woven together to create a kind of new future. So diving right into the Waldorf Astoria, its origin story, if you'll allow me to digress for a few moments, is so fun, all wrapped up in the Gilded Age of New York, that it's hard to resist retelling it briefly. So it begins with two cousins, William Waldorf Astor and John Jacob Astor IV. These two guys did not get along very well. They would, happen to be at breakfast in the same room, having tea, and they wouldn't even talk to each other, wouldn't even acknowledge each other's existence. Well, they happened to have mansions on the same block of Fifth Avenue between 33rd and 34th Street on opposing corners. William Waldorf Astor at one point decided he was going to move to the UK. He was going to abandon New York and the United States. And he tore down his mansion and built a hotel to generate income, the Waldorf Hotel, which you see here in both images. You can see Mr. Astor's mansion in the foreground on the image on the right. He lived with his mother, Caroline Astor, of the famous Astor 400, a kind of tastemaker in New York society. And they were so upset by the Waldorf Hotel overshadowing their mansion that they decided to tear down their mansion and build their own hotel, which vastly overshadowed the original Waldorf Hotel, which you see looking very small in the background in this image on the left. And so this is how we came to have the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. They were in fact interconnected and always acted as one. However, it didn't last too long. It was very successful, but that site was actually purchased for the Empire State Building, and the original Waldorf Astoria was torn down. The building moved north to its current location at 49th Street and Park Avenue to take advantage of the new Grand Central Terminal and the importance of rail travel, and was built over those existing rail tracks, which you can see here in the image below this power plant at the site of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And the architectural firm of Schultz and Weaver was hired to design this new hotel. They were a well-known hotel architect, designing other significant landmarks here in New York and around the United States as well. And they designed a hotel that had a kind of split personality. It was a kind of transitional building. It borrowed from some of the nostalgic elements of the original Waldorf Astoria hotel that folks remembered, but it was also had to be a modern, up-to-date, contemporary building. And so it really truly is, despite its contrast to Lever House at the beginning of this, a modern building. It's an Art Deco building. This kind of split personality, this transitional sense was received in a variety of ways, sometimes positive, sometimes not so positive, as in the case of Herbert Muschamp here in his New Yorker article. Nonetheless, the building opened to great fanfare and several decades of great success. It was frequented by celebrities, politicians, the elite. Significant events took place there. President Kennedy is speaking. Grace Kelly, was married to the Prince of Monaco there. So a very important cultural element of the United States and of New York in particular. Beginning in the 1960s, however, times began to change. So we have the rise of the jet age and the decreased importance of rail travel. Architectural modernism, makes a big entree into, what's considered new and contemporary and hip. And so the Waldorf Astoria responds to these changing times in this beginning of a slow decline by beginning to renovate. And they renovate their spaces in sometimes not so sympathetic ways. So we have a grand ballroom that's highly altered in this kind of French Baroque decorative style. We have a main lobby, the clock lobby, many of you may have visited in the 1970s, is paneled in blue lacquered panels and has palm fronds at the capitals of its columns, gilded entirely. So many insensitive changes, which is to say what you may have seen in recent memory was not necessarily the original condition. Nonetheless, despite these changes, the building is landmarked in 1993, which is why it's a part of Carol's exhibition today. In New York City, exterior landmarks and interior landmarks are two distinct designations. This building is an exterior landmark, so designated in 1993, and a very large portion, I believe the largest privately owned interior landmark, is landmarked in 2017. So it's doubly protected in a manner of speaking. So the project at hand, which we undertook beginning in 2016, was to convert a 1,400 key hotel to 375 keys, so there'll still be a hotel component, plus 375 condominium residences. And so that's the big change. There's many other changes we'll talk about, as well as restoration to many of the public spaces. And it really always was and will continue to be an entire city within a building, a whole diversity of programs, from retail to events to hotel to residences. You can find it all in this building. That will continue to be the case. It's 1.6 million square feet, an entire city block. And so composing all these elements is a kind of three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. So how does one go about creating that change, that transformation? So we'll talk about the reconfiguration of the building to start with. So the ground floor plan, for example, at Park Avenue on the left, we need two entrances. Now we need a hotel entrance and we need a residential entrance. We need porte cocheres for the hotel, which we now have on the south, and for the residential component on the north. And so you can see here highlighted in yellow and blue, you have two competing in parallel experiences, entry, lobby, and so forth. And so, for example, you have the existing condition before construction began in the small photo and the new condition in the larger photo, where we have introduced a new front door, a new entrance for that residential component where there previously was a storefront window, while maintaining the central symmetricality of the Art Deco composition, creating a new canopy subservient to the larger canopy. At the mid-block portion, so we're still looking at ground floor plans here, there always was a porte cochere. You could drive all the way from 49th Street through that porte cochere to 50th Street, as seen in the image on the left. That was still the case at the time that construction began, although the composure of those elements had changed quite a bit. And in the future, we're bifurcating that porte cochere into two distinct cocheres, one for each of those two programs, while restoring the configuration and the appearance of those openings on the exterior. They've been badly altered today, bricked in and so forth, filled with louvers. And so this is what they will look like from the exterior in the future, while having created an entirely new experience on the interior. Bifurcating those porte cocheres allows us to do something else, though, which is to put the residential lobby where it really wants to be, at the center of the building, at the center of the block, and allows us to take from that residential lobby corridors to two distinct elevator cores, one on the east, one on the west. The building essentially has two wings now, and one would take one of those two elevators up to your residential unit. That allows us to eliminate corridors which used to connect the two wings of the building, creating a lot more new found space, if you will, and to create through floor units at that center spot, because we no longer need a corridor connecting those two distinct cores. So there's a lot of kind of behind the scenes reworking of infrastructure like that in order to make a transformation like this possible. And that all is in service of the residential units. So here you see a typical floor plan of the Waldorf Astoria at a lower level. It's a very large floor plan, but it just separated into two wings when we get off the elevator core on one side or the other and go to your unit. When working with an existing building, it has to work with what's there. So the units are more cellular. There are crown moldings and coves around individual rooms. If this were a brand new residential building, what we generally see on the market is a flat ceiling, very, very open plan, right? Kitchen, living, dining. You still have that openness that's contemporary here today, but within the framework of beams and columns and punched windows that already exist there. So one has to work with the existing structure and rhythm of the building that is there. So moving to the public spaces, the Waldorf Astoria, I think, is really special because it has this incredible abundance of public spaces that you can just walk right in. And when I started this project, there wasn't a person that I told about it that didn't tell me, well, I cut through the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria every day on my way to work for 10 years, or I stayed there, on the night of my wedding. Every New Yorker has a Waldorf Astoria, and this public space is a big part of that. So these are section drawings. There are 3 of them here indicating the original condition, and that is a Schultz and Weaver drawing that we found in their archives. The center is an existing condition drawing that we drew, and the bottom is a proposed future condition that we also drew. So we can very carefully compare all 3 of these states to one another. So one can walk in at Park Avenue on the left, go up the grand stairs and walk all the way through these generous public spaces and back down out Lexington Avenue. You can also walk up to the 3rd floor where there are a variety of event spaces. This is what those spaces looked like originally in plan. So this is the main level of the hotel. It's actually up 1 level from that porte cochere level that we were looking at before. And this is another original drawing that we found in the Schultz and Weaver archive. And I will admit to you that we did not understand the configuration of these public spaces until one of our designers was tracing over this original drawing with a thick pen. And it was at that moment that we realized, as you move in an enfilade fashion from one avenue to the other, that the spaces expand and compress in a perfectly alternating rhythm as you move along. And this must have been to increase the sense of drama, and I think aligns with the variety of styles and decoration that one finds in room to room. How come we didn't realize this? Well, because the spaces have been changed and altered so badly over time that when you visited, you really just didn't even understand that. Spaces have been chopped in half, had restaurants inserted into them, had a store inserted into them, and really changed so much that sense of procession and drama had been lost. And so in the future condition, we're going to be able to restore that sense of drama as one moves through these public spaces. I'm very excited about that. And I'll show you just a couple examples of perhaps the most significant public spaces. We'll start with the Park Avenue foyer. But before we do, one additional theme that we're able to restore is the sense of lighting. And so we discovered in researching this project that there was this idea about how lighting should be handled in all the public spaces, that it should be indirect, that it should be somehow mysterious. So I always compare it to Grand Central Terminal. That's how I think about it. So just down the road, built in 1903. There, the electric lighting of a public building was brand new. And so there are these chandeliers and they have exposed bulbs on them. They're showing off, this building is electrically lit. Isn't that great? Well, here, a few years later, 1931, the new thing will be to hide the sources of lighting. How is this space lit? It's mysterious. And that was consistent through the public spaces. However, that had been lost. That sensibility had been lost over time as piecemeal renovations had taken place. So for example, this is the Park Avenue foyer. The image on the right is the condition before current construction began. And there was this non-original ceiling with this non-original light fixture, not very sensitively done, we would say. And we were comparing it to this original condition photo that we found. And again, after looking at this photo over and over and over, we noticed that in that center panel, there's a reflection of the columns below. I don't know if you can see that on Zoom. And that reflection disappears in the surrounding panels. We realized that those central panels are different material than the surrounding panels. So we went to the additional original source material to try to find out. We have a clue. What does that mean? So in addition to the drawings, we had found the original specification book. This is about this thick, done by Schultz and Weaver. All of their archives are held at the Wolfsonian Museum in Florida. We had every single page of this book photographed. And we found that at the center, this was backlit marble. And so that's an element that will bring back, will restore. So there will be this thinly sliced marble at the center point of the ceiling that is illuminated from above, giving the room a kind of soft glow. And so through this research, we're able to restore elements which paradoxically, when one visits the building, will be brand new. No one has seen anything like this for decades, even though it is the original condition. Moving on to the main lobby, often referred to as the clock lobby. The clock actually wasn't there at its origination. It did come soon after the building opened. It will be returning to the building. It's at the New York Historical Society for the moment. But we see the room was actually fairly light. It has dark columns, but there was a light wood paneling around it, a light decorative plaster ceiling, and freestanding lights around. This is the condition before the building closed for renovation. So very, very different. All the wood paneling was non-original, very dark, and they subsequently, understandably, had trouble lighting this space appropriately and did things like introduce this frieze, which I think kind of harmed the proportions of the room, but they were trying to make it feel lighter and brighter. And so in the future condition, through a lot of kind of forensic research where we can discover, what were some of the original materials, either through the specification book or through finding them buried beneath additional layers of new materials, or find original colors, we can restore spaces like this to their original splendor and put in new paneling, which matches the species and the color and staining of the original paneling. So here you see the original plaster ceiling, which is being restored, the original marble columns, which are intact and being restored, and then the new wood paneling. And all that will be combined with a new way to move through this space. So that had been altered as well. And this space in the future will be a lounge. You'll be able to move through all four cardinal axes, which you could originally, but haven't been able to in recent history. And I think it'll be a really entirely new and different experience, even though it's being restored to something much closer to its original condition. Finally, I'd like to touch on the Grand Ballroom, famous space that many of you may have been to for various events. So here we have, again, Schultz and Weaver's section drawing, as well as a rendering in the senior designer's hand. And what we learned from these drawings is the sense that this space actually was meant to be quite modern. It was meant to be quite bright, quite lofty in its proportions, and fairly spare. And in fact, the ceiling was illuminated by 3 cove lights, which we can make out on either side of that ceiling in the section drawing above. So kind of mysterious, hidden light sources. Now, the lighting technology of the day never was really quite up to that task. And in fact, all 3 of those coves were not actually built. And what we see is the accretion of additional light fixtures, including the enormous chandelier at the center of the space, as attempts to kind of fix this issue with the lighting. And so what we're doing in the future today under construction is to restore, maintain and restore the decorative medallion and decorative elements of the ceiling, but change its geometry to include for the first time those 3 hidden light sources as was originally intended but never built, and to use modern LED lighting technology, which can push light farther and more strongly to achieve an effect which is more similar to the originally intended space, a bright, lofty ceiling, featuring only its decorative elements. The exterior was also analyzed in great detail, using the same kind of taxonomy of comparing original to existing to proposed. And here we've color-coded in red on the existing drawing everything that was non-original. And what we glean from this is, even though you may have walked by the building and thought, oh, there's this great building from 1931, it looks just like it did. In fact, much of the fabric was non-original and had been replaced. We've color-coded in the proposed everything that will be restored, as well as altered in one way or another. One of those significant alterations is the windows. So originally this building had steel frame windows. They have very thin frames. At some point in the 1980s, the glass was removed from those windows, the frames were left, and new aluminum frame windows were attached over the top of those in-place steel frames. So that new aluminum frame, of course, was much thicker, didn't harmonize with the architecture as well. It was a different color than the original. And so we are taking out those non-original windows. We're taking out the corroded out original steel frames and inserting new high-performance windows from an energy acoustical standpoint that have frames which exactly match the original sight lines and dimensions of the original windows, as well as match the existing color, which we found there was 1 original window extent on the entire building. We are doing this 5,380 times over. There are additionally wonderful decorative spandrel panels all around the building of different types: terracotta, cast aluminum, cast stone. Many of these, somewhat unbelievably, have been punctured by mechanical equipment over the years, which you see in the image on the left here. And so we've identified artisans to work with to recreate new replicas of these beautiful original spandrel conditions. And so here you see a recreation of one of those cast aluminum spandrel panels, which you see in the process of being poured in the center image. So there are many small restorative elements such as windows and spandrel panels and cleaning and so forth that go together to make up this project, as well as more significant reconfigurations of the spaces inside. But it's our proposition that when you put these small pieces together, these small moves, even though you might not understand, those windows changed color, they'll all create something that is greater than the sum of the parts. And when one walks by the building, my aspiration is that it will seem like something new. People will notice it for the first time. Wow, there's something different there. That's sparkling, like it really hadn't before. And people will be invited in and want to come in a way that they haven't in decades. So Amy's gonna take us forward a couple decades and tell us how times changed quickly along Park Avenue.
Thanks, Frank. Hi, everybody. My name's Amy Garlock, and I worked with Frank on the Waldorf Astoria, and I also have worked on Lever House. And as Frank said at the beginning, only 21 years separates the completion of the construction of the Waldorf Astoria from the completion of Lever House. But those were very eventful 20 years. It's 1930s and 1940s. And I have a picture here of the Bauhaus because the Bauhaus was founded in 1919, so even before the construction of the Waldorf Astoria. But significantly, it was closed in 1933 due to the Nazi Party, and significantly, many of the leading architects from the Bauhaus came over to the United States and came and taught in educations of higher learning, most importantly, Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe. And they brought the ideas of the international style, as it came to be called, to the United States. And these ideas started to inform the architecture in the 1940s and into the 1950s, and came to kind of define the new style of post-war architecture. Mies van der Rohe working primarily in Chicago, and Walter Gropius influencing and advising on Harrison and Abramowitz's design for the United Nations headquarters, which predates Lever House by a couple months, and is the first example of a built curtain wall building in New York City. And the curtain wall was part of the thinking of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill as they thought about how to establish themselves as a practice in New York City. They were working in Chicago as well, of course, but they were a relatively young practice in 1952 when Lever House was completed. And Nathaniel Owings, one of the founding partners, was the lead designer in charge of the Lever House project, but working with him very closely were both Gordon Bunshaft, who is responsible for the lead designs of many of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill's most notable mid-century works. And under Gordon Bunshaft, Natalie DeBlois, who also became a senior principal here in the New York office, and also worked on the Pepsi Cola headquarters, also on Park Avenue up at 59th Street. And the three of them had already started thinking about an international style office building. And this drawing is not of Lever House, it's of a generic proposal that they'd been shopping around to clients. Thinking about this, I think this was cited somewhere else, maybe a Midwestern city. But this idea was of a public ground floor space, a large podium with a terrace on top of it, and a curtain wall office building on top of that. And good architects need good clients as well. And in the case of Lever House, that was Charles Luckman, who was trained as an architect, and then found himself in the presidency of first Pepsodent and then Lever Brothers. And so he was at Lever Brothers and looking for new architects with new ideas to make a new headquarters for Lever House on Park Avenue. And like at the Waldorf Astoria, the restoration of Lever House comes down to many different items and ideas, but we had to start with the original design intent. And very luckily, we are still around as Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. And so we have access to a great wealth of information about the original building design, as well as changes over time. We can look at the existing conditions, both changes that have been made, but also the weathering of the existing materials. And just like the Waldorf Astoria, we have many experiences from people who have worked in the building over the years, since it started as, continued to be an office building over the years, it's a little bit less complex spatially in terms of the changes that we're making relative to the Waldorf Astoria, but it's still materially very similar, the kinds of operations that we need to undertake. Lever House itself was landmarked in 1982, and it really is an example that set the stage for the development of Park Avenue in the post-war years. You can see here the building in its context soon after it was built. And as Frank showed in the beginning of this presentation, Park Avenue between the construction of Grand Central Terminal and the early 1950s was really defined by an avenue of masonry buildings. And so when Lever House was built, it really felt like a spaceship from another planet. It really radically broke with the architecture of the avenue. But if you've been to Park Avenue recently, you can see it really changed it for good and created many towers in its model. It is quite different from many of its imitators, however, in its form. The tower itself is very small relative to the size of the lot, and it leaves a lot of light and air around it. It does not take up its full zoning envelope by any means, but instead it invites the public in at the ground floor and really touches the ground very lightly. And this courtyard at the base is open, and it also, the lobby is enclosed in glass that's very transparent and large pieces of glass. And so the planters, the ceiling and the floor, they all travel seamlessly inside and outside to create the impression of a building that is completely floating. Of course, the curtain wall was also revolutionary. The technical precedent of this curtain wall informed many of the other buildings along the avenue. And it's something that set SOM up as a business to continue to create more wonderful modernist office buildings similar to this one. Here you can see the configuration of the podium and the tower and the open space at the ground floor below that podium, and the large welcoming terrace on the third floor above that podium. And at the ground floor, as I was saying, the lobby is really the only presence that intrudes onto this large open public plaza with a planter, which originally had a water feature designed into it that was never built, and a very concise display kitchen, assembly hall, and loading bar at the back of the site towards Madison Avenue. That assembly hall and display kitchen today is a restaurant. And the lobby itself, you can see how the materials move between the interior and exterior seamlessly, and very minimal furnishings in the original intent. You can also see in the left side of this image here, there were display cases that still remain today in the lobby, and these were for displaying Lever Brothers products. On the third floor at the top of that podium, there was a dining area for the employees of Lever Brothers, as well as a large terrace for them to have fun and dine outside. My favorite is the original shuffleboard court, which we're hoping to reinstate. And the tower itself is relatively narrow, only 53 feet wide, with a single row of columns down the center. And what that made for was very light and bright office spaces for the many employees of the Lever Brothers, as well as expansive views up and down Park Avenue by pulling back the column from the corner of the building. The curtain wall under construction here, and a detail of the curtain wall. Now, you may think that Lever House is a much more modern appearing building than the Waldorf Astoria. But really, when you look at the curtain wall in section in this original drawing, you can see that it is kind of a masonry building with a veneer of glass on the outside. Because of New York City fire codes, it is actually required, at least it was at that time, to have significant amount of masonry separating each floor. And the masonry is required to hold up those spandrel panels of glass. So the actual proportion of the windows in Lever House is not so different from what you get at the Waldorf Astoria, even though they're using very different kinds of technology to achieve their exterior skin. And Lever House was looking towards the future in terms of building maintenance, and engineered and integrated a building maintenance unit or a window washing unit, which they used to maintain the building and also to advertise their soap. And the building itself was a great advertisement for Lever Brothers when it was completed. It was great for employee retention, and it also was an advertisement for themselves as a brand that was forward thinking. And the building itself was really received quite rapturously almost right away. SOM certainly did our part to promote it by showing it in a MoMA exhibition as it was still under construction, and really promoting it to all of the press. But it was really seen as a standard bearer almost as soon as it had opened. And we've had the extraordinary opportunity to really take care of this building over time. For a building that is just over 70 years old, it remains relevant and it remains looking quite new, but that's because we've been taking care of it for that whole time. And also because of its landmarking. In 1983, it was threatened by a development, and this really triggered outcry from Jackie Onassis and Philip Johnson, who were integral in the creation of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And so Lever House was landmarked partially to prevent its redevelopment. And so because it's been landmarked, all of the work that we've done over the years is sensitive to its original condition. And it has to be, not just because we want to preserve this for the future, but also because everything that goes through renovation process needs to be reviewed by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So the original curtain wall was made with carbon steel core and stainless steel cladding. And by the mid 1990s, that carbon steel that was holding up the stainless steel cladding had corroded due to some sealant failures, and basically just 1950s era curtain wall technology, which has since improved greatly. And so the first project that SOM took on in the late 1990s was the replacement of the curtain wall, including replacement of much of the glass, and replacement of the cores that are holding up the pieces of the curtain wall. However, the stainless steel exterior was restored or replaced only when damaged. And so there are original pieces of the facade that remain. And the original design intent was completely preserved, both in the color of the building and the kind of hierarchy of the stainless steel, especially the window washing tracks that define its structural bays. And so when we came back to the building in 2020 under new ownership, we took a look at the building and looked at where the building was showing its age. And for us, that was really the plaza at the ground floor and the terrace on level 3. Here you can see some paving primarily, and the ceiling, the stair core. All of these elements have been exposed to the weather for 70 years, and the freeze-thaw cycle in New York. The paving was in the most dire shape, and it really originally was this clean extension of the interior terrazzo into the exterior plaza, with the inscription of the structural grid in the light color of the exterior terrazzo with the dark colored infill of the grid. The existing condition preserved some of the light and dark, but had been patched over time. The terrazzo dividers were showing. Basically every winter, the water got in, froze, and spalled this exterior terrazzo. So it was not holding up very well and was not safe. And we looked to the interior terrazzo to think about how to restore this. The interior terrazzo was in much better shape. It did have cracking and some material loss at the metal joints, but it had the original aggregate and the original color of the cement binder. And we know that the interior and exterior were intended to be the same. So we did spectrographic analysis of the stone to try and understand what types of stone and what the exact color mix of the cement was. And we took that and we applied it to extensive mock-up testing, refinishing testing, both at the interior to reference for color and stone type. And on the right, you can see a sample of potential exterior paving where we used a more durable concrete mix with a greater thickness to try and counteract some of that freeze-thaw cycle. You can see here some more of our mock-ups and what I like to call science projects, trying to understand how we can most closely match the original condition in a way that will be durable for a long time. There is a black limestone wall that runs the length of the site in front of the now restaurant, but what used to be that show kitchen, and it runs into the lobby. That limestone had oxidized over time, really lightening the color, and it had been deteriorated by some unsympathetic sealants and some corroded metal. And so we did many mock-ups and testing of repolishing. You can see in the center, the repolishing really changes the color. And I'm happy to say the progress on the lower right-hand side, you can see a huge difference from when we were brought onto the project. There are white marble cladding on each of the stair cores and also in the elevator lobby. We matched this to a quarry in Danby, Vermont. And so where possible, we preserved the original marble at the stair cores and especially at the interior where it was in good shape. We refinished it. It had been shined to a very high polish over time, which was not the original design intent. There were some patches too where we had to use paint and artistry to conceal some cracks. And then where we couldn't repair it because it was too far gone, too much material lost, we replaced it in kind with matching material that we got from the quarry in Vermont. All of the stainless steel on the columns was as much as possible retained. We took it off site, and basically these are hand processes where there's a guy who takes a hammer and hammers the dent in the opposite direction and uses a polisher and a power washer to refinish this back to its original brushed finish. And the plaster ceiling, we also did extensive mock-up and material testing. The plaster itself was cracking and damaged by water over the years. And so a modern stucco plaster has been used to replace it, which will be more durable both at the interior and exterior, but matches the original finish and the original jointing. And at the plaza, the original, there were designs as I showed that had a water feature, which was, there was actually a foundation built for it, but it itself was never built. The original planting was kind of a raised bed with a single tree. But we are proposing to replace that, and it is in progress. You can go see with a grove of birch trees, which will create kind of a central feature and emphasize that continuity of interior and exterior, and the birches also echo the rhythm of the columns in the plaza itself. We've replaced the lighting. You can see the very dark condition during the daytime prior to restoration. And by replacing the light fixtures themselves with modern LEDs, we're able to greatly increase the amount of light on the plaza to make it a nicer place to be. At the lobby, at the interior, we've focused on restoration of materials, same as at the exterior. There's also a Murano glass tile wall at the rear of the lobby that we've patched, extended, and cleaned thoroughly using great forensic care. And the lobby itself is intended to remain open and clear as it was originally, with those display cases and with seating for people to wait. The roof terrace itself, we have that great shuffleboard court and the original paving. When we came back to the project, the paving was all not original and painted this kind of bright red. The trees were not in healthy shape. They had outgrown the shallow bases of the planters. And so we've proposed new furniture and lighting and new planting to have this be an amenity space for all of the tenants in the building. And we've also found opportunities to bring interior and exterior closer together, similar to how we have that at the lobby. And the office spaces themselves will be renovated and brightened to keep this building relevant and into the future, which is really the goal of all of this restoration work. This building is 70 years old, and we hope it can last another 70 years. And the Waldorf and Lever House are still relevant, not just because of the work that we're doing, but also because of landmarks. And because these buildings are landmarked, there is additional incentive to think of creative ways to keep them relevant into the future. And it creates a Park Avenue where you have a greater diversity of buildings because you have all of these buildings representing different points in New York's history. We have to be thoughtful about how we keep these buildings feeling fresh, feeling contemporary, and learning about the past of architecture through our investigation of these buildings. Despite the difference in age and difference in appearance, a lot of the methods that we've gleaned from both of these are shared. And, restoration, we always think about that as something of a paradox, because by restoring it, you're actually creating something new, which then refers back to the original. And it's this kind of cycle where the two are kind of inseparable. And so that's why we're calling this the future of the past and the past of the future. Everything that's old will become new in the future. And by restoring these, we're ensuring that the future of Park Avenue is bright. We want to make sure to thank the extensive teams that we've worked with on both of these projects. You can see here both our wonderful clients and also our long list of consultants with whom we've collaborated.
Oh, I'd like to call out Amy, the clients in particular, Daja US for the Waldorf Astoria and Brookfield Properties, together with Waterman Clark in the case of Lever House. It's clients like them that have the vision and foresight to undertake projects like these and assemble the team that Amy was speaking about.
Yeah, and we thank you guys for your attention this evening. And I know that Carol, I think, has some questions for us.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Amy and Frank. It was a really fantastic presentation. I would love to ask you at least one question, and kind of you have completely wrapped up this package of the pair of landmark buildings with a perfect container of thought and content. And let's see. SOM is not usually thought of as a preservation architect. In fact, Frank is the head of adaptive reuse and global practice. There's a forward-looking aspect to the phrasing of that particular approach that seems more in line with SOM's tradition of the new and innovation and new forms. So it's absolutely fascinating to see the forensic attention that you give to a building that is already designed by the firm, and the research within an aesthetic that you completely understand. And then likewise with the Waldorf Astoria, how you researched into the archives to look for the design intent and to recover some of that original Beaux-Arts really influence sensibility. And so my question, since you've credited landmarks and you have mentioned your clients, is can you describe a little bit more fully the kind of triangular relationship of the architect, the client, and the Landmarks Preservation Commission? Because you have beautifully illuminated how the architect takes the lead in unearthing and organizing unearthing the research that's necessary, searching for the original intent, convincing the Landmarks Commission that this is appropriate to move forward. But how does the client figure into this equation or triangle? Is it simply to write checks and accept the decisions that you offer them? What's the client's role, and how does it really work as a kind of team dynamic? And how much is landmarks collaborative, and how much is it regulation that sometimes you want to resist?
Sure. Well, we can both, perhaps speak to that. We've both been through that experience together and on separate projects as well. So there's no architectural project without a client. They initiate it and have the foresight, to undertake. In the case of Lever House, a restoration and repositioning, a readying of a boutique office building for the future. In the case of the Waldorf Astoria, the foresight to completely transform the building in large part to something brand new. So there's absolutely no underplaying the importance of the client. They initiate the project. They are the decision maker. So there are a lot more than the purse strings, as you allude to. The client in many cases seeks out an architect in projects like these for a twofold purpose. One is design expertise, but a second might be experience with the Landmarks Preservation Commission, specifically here in New York City. And so understand, SOM is not necessarily known for that particular experience, but it is something that we do have quite a bit of, and we're interested in old things equally as much as we are in new things. And so we have a collaborative, relationship with landmarks. And some of these clients do as well, and see them, on multiple projects. Others are more new. Brookfield, I'm sure, has seen them many times. And so all three parties, work together. There's, of course, creative tension. That's the architect's job to put forward creative, provocative ideas, while, hopefully maintaining the integrity of the building. So all three parties perhaps have, slightly different, bents on, a similar intention.
I think we would also be completely remiss if we did not mention the involvement on both of these projects of Higgins, Quaysworth and Partners, who were the Landmarks Preservation Consultants. They have deep knowledge of both the way that LPC works and of historic buildings and processes. And so on both of these projects, Frank and I worked closely together with their team to craft presentations, and closely together with the staff at LPC to understand the designation reports, the things that were important about the building, and what is important to restore, what is not original and therefore potentially fungible. And then also, the clients come along with us on that journey of education so that they can understand the value of their asset. And in both cases, there were negotiations. It's not a linear process. Excuse me. There were things potentially that we proposed or that the client proposed that were not in line with either the expectations of the landmark or the feasibility of adapting a historic building. And so, over time, we come to a final design proposal that everybody can be happy with. And so, yeah, it's more of a square, but everybody has to work together.
I think one of the things that we phrased in the promotion of this evening and the pairing of the buildings was lessons learned. You've talked about how they're separated very much by a short period of time. How similar are the projects from the architect's process point of view, and what did you learn from their differences that makes you think about other buildings that may not be landmarks, but yet have required the same or should require the same level of sensitivity to design values, even if they're not regulated by an outside body?
So in the case of Lever House, it was very interesting that a building that is ostensibly meant to be made of machine-made materials, that are put together, and the architect's job is, to configure them, the grammar of the way they are assembled, that the restoration processes for those machine-made materials was largely a hand-done process by, individual artisans. And so that was immediately familiar to our experience at the Waldorf Astoria. And so even though they belong to two supposedly entirely different schools of building technology, the restoration approach actually was quite similar. That's, I think, somewhat surprising.
Yeah, I think, they're very different projects in that the Waldorf is like 6 times the size of Lever House and much more complex. But I think the material attention is kind of similar, as Frank said. I think the planning process is a bit different in the two and requires a different kind of negotiation.
They're also both deeply rooted in research. So projects start in the same place. And that's really the big, difference between a new building project and one engaging with an existing building is the research. And so that's, no different between the two projects. You may be researching different aspects, but you have to understand what's there, how it got there, and why in order to propose, any change or restoration.
And this is one more thing that's, I think, familiar to anybody who's done a renovation project, even of your kitchen, is that once you actually get started, nothing is where you thought it was going to be. There's always adaptation that's required. And, for both of these projects, the construction administration phase is even more critical than on a usual project, because you have to be on site thinking about the design intent and detail as you expose different conditions through demolition selectively. We did a lot of testing, a lot of mock-ups, a lot more so than you might do for a typical ground up construction project.
So as architects finding a path, a career path, maybe other, students coming out of school and thinking about what they want to practice, really devote their expertise to. Do you find that preservation projects are as rewarding, more challenging? How do they compare to entirely new projects of pure invention?
I think it's totally critical because we can't just tear everything down and start new. It's not sustainable, especially in a place like New York City, which has so much wonderful, architecture already built. It's critical that we think about how to take what we have and make it valuable for ourselves in the future. Obviously, Frank and I work on new projects as well, and I think they're equally rewarding and maybe in different ways. But certainly on both of these projects, we felt, a deep responsibility to make these projects, the way that they had felt, radical and new and exciting to people when they first opened, to have them continue to feel that vital and part of the city life into the future.
I find them very rewarding. I think they're incredibly important projects for all the reasons that Amy mentioned. You get to look back and forward at the same time. I like learning about history. And another piece that I find satisfying is that we do have young designers coming out of school asking about adaptive reuse projects, or sharing an adaptive reuse studio project that they did with us, or asking us about Lever House, or whatever the case may be. And I know when I was in school, I certainly didn't have any adaptive reuse projects for a studio, and that certainly was not something on students' radar. So I think an awareness of the interest and excitement of this type of work, as well as its critical role in combating climate change and ensuring, kind of cultural continuity for our cities. All of these reasons, are growing in awareness in the academy as well as the general population, which is great.
Yeah. Well, we're appropriately over this evening, because this was such a rich double header that there's no way we could abbreviate it in any way how immensely interesting both of these projects are, and as you say, important to New York. And we're a city of change, but thank goodness these buildings are going to not just be recognizable, stay the same, but they're going to be better for the future too. So thanks for your work on that. And everybody join us next week for a series on the modern concrete skyscraper. And we've certainly been treated to two eras of modernism and SOM's role in refreshing them for the future. So thanks, Amy. Thanks, Frank. And
Thank you, Carol.
see you next time.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.